Hi, everyone, and welcome to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is TNC in Massachusetts webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers from New England and around the world. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm Deb Markowitz, State Director of the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts and your host. And today we're going to be talking with Jason Jacobs. Jason is a software entrepreneur and founder of RunKeeper, and now a podcaster and activist. We'll be talking with Jason about his journey to learn more about climate change and his decision to shift his entire career focus to tackling climate change and educating others about the importance of this. Jason started a newsletter and then a podcast called My Climate Journey, in which he shares insights from climate experts across sectors. He's also organized a vibrant community around the podcast, and he's putting his money where his mouth is by investing in climate technology startups. Today, we bring you along on the learning journey as well, and I want to just thank you so much, Jason, for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Deb. Very honored and excited to be here.
Well, I thought this is just going to be a conversation for those of you who are used to webinars with slides, and this will be a little less formal. We're going to just talk, and we're going to encourage you actually to ask your questions too as we go along. You can see there's a Q&A tab at the bottom. Feel free to put your questions in there. And I just thought I'd start by asking you, Jason, to tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to shift your focus from technology to climate change.
Sure. Well, let's see. I guess the climate focus is kind of the third chapter in my career. I was a liberal arts undergrad, and then I just kind of fell into the technology industry in the late 90s. And I've worked in the technology industry my entire career. The first phase of that was in functional roles of increasing responsibility in small, high growth startups. And I loved the people I worked with and the sport of business and the rate of change in technology and serving customers and making money and winning and things like that. But the widget wasn't necessarily important to me. I didn't want to do harm, but as long as we were serving customers and doing good work, I thought that's what mattered. I'm not an engineer by training, so I didn't think I could work in an area of technology that was personally relatable. The companies I worked at were typically selling infrastructure software into big banks and health systems, kind of the plumbing of the internet. So very important, but just not, selling infrastructure software to information technology organizations as a liberal arts major or undergrad was not the most relatable. And then I ended up starting a company. It was a running technology company. And I didn't come at that as a technology person first. I came at it as a runner first. And actually, in hindsight, the reason it took me so long to start a company was because I thought the widget didn't matter, where actually the widget for me matters a whole lot. And so that was a big epiphany for me that I could actually combine my two loves of building technology companies and fitness, which was like more than a passion. It was like part of the fabric of who I am.
Let me just interrupt. Yeah. So it sounds like you're moving in your lifetime from doing a job, making money, to really wanting a life of meaning and purpose and having your work be part of that.
Yeah, and so that second phase was that was almost a decade of building that fitness technology company, and that was the first company where I really loved the domain. And that company, we raised a lot of money over the course of that company, and it was a pretty stressful, bumpy ride, and we had a kind of a near-death, not a personal near-death experience, but a professional near-death experience along the way, and we had to we almost ran out of money, and we had to cut a third of the team, and we had to, rebuild the leadership team more excited about a more narrow, focused, profitable path, and ultimately got healthy and got acquired. And, ASICS, the big Japanese shoe company, acquired us, and I ran digital there for a couple of years and then left and took some time off to get myself healthy and rest and recover after this grueling ride. And I just had this kind of wave of survivor guilt where I thought, like, gosh, there was so much luck and privilege and timing that went into having this outcome that we had. And I'm not worthy. Like, if one of 100 things that had to come together for that to happen, if any one of them hadn't happened, then that outcome wouldn't have happened. And it really made me want to devote my next chapter to working on something important. You know, fitness is important, but in a way, even having the time for fitness is a privilege. And so I really wanted to work on, I think, something that was more of kind of a widespread societal challenge. And meanwhile, I'd just been growing increasingly concerned my whole life with, I mean, back when I was in grade school, learning about the ozone layer and stuff. And I mean, just these existential things are the things that get me and are the biggest sources of anxiety for me. So climate was one of the things that I was really looking at. And when I first looked at it, I actually didn't feel like I brought a lot to helping address it. I thought, like, I don't really understand it. I don't know the best ways to solve it. I don't know how my skills are transferable. And so I talked myself into trying to start another consumer-focused technology company like I had known. And I got the same founding team back together from my last venture, and we raised some money. And I got a few months in, and I just couldn't do it. It was actually a really fertile area, which is frustrating because, especially with the pandemic, that really would have flourished financially, but that's not what's motivating me at this point. But we were onto something. But I just felt like a mercenary, and it was literally during this 6-month period of trying to get this company off the ground where the 1.5 degree IPCC report came out, where Trump took steps to withdraw us from Paris, where the scientific community was foaming at the mouth and nobody was listening. The symptoms were more visible and obvious. And so I would like focus for a period of a week or two, and then some bad news and climate would come out and it would send me into some tailspin. So finally, I just got to a point where I realized that, like, my co-founders, all they wanted to do was go chase one of these great fertile areas we were investigating. And all I wanted to do was go walk in the woods. So we still had more than 90% of the small amount of capital that we had raised. And I just returned that to the investors that had backed us, and there was no ill will. In fact, all of them are partners with us on the things that I'm doing now. But I essentially just came back into focusing on climate with all the same concerns about where I would fit, but a lot more determined to figure it out. This was like late 2018,
yep.
And just came in as a learner and put me aside and said, I'm gonna just first better understand the problem and the ways to address it, and I'll figure out where I fit later. And that's kind of where it started 2 years ago. And I haven't looked back.
Well, I would bet a lot of the people on this webinar can kind of relate to this, especially now with the pandemic. It's this question, like, how we have so much privilege. Like, no matter what the challenges each of us are facing, we just the fact that we're here and can be here, part of this conversation, we have a lot of privilege. How do we use that privilege to make the world a better place? And then that question, like, well, what can I bring to the table? And what I love about your story is what you brought was really a determination to begin by learning and understanding and not feeling like you already had to know what your role in the solution needed to be. So I think that's very relatable, I would imagine, for people listening. And that, I know, especially at this time where, when we're in our homes and there's this pandemic, thinking, okay, how do I contribute to making the world a better place? And so, you've created a pretty, rich audience. And when you first got started with the My Climate Journey podcast, how did you reach out to experts? How did you get started and build your audience?
Yeah, well, it really wasn't about building an audience to start. It was just about learning. So I got some books and started reading and started Googling and to find the people that looked like they knew what they were doing, and people with diverse backgrounds and perspectives as well, because I didn't just want the perspective from one solution type or one or just from nonprofits, for example. I really wanted to kind of just get a holistic view. It's just I think how I like to unpack any complex problem. And so I would just reach out cold and say, hey, like, I sold my company and want to work on something important and can't imagine more important. I would just say what I just said to you, and like, would you be open to talking? And because, as you've probably experienced, because this is such a mission-driven area, I think it's just more collaborative and people are more open with their time than maybe in some other more kind of transactional or mercenary pursuits. So people were very generous with their time, which I'm deeply appreciative of. And they also were excited that some new blood was coming in from other places. And so they would say, keep me posted on your progress. I can't wait to see how this plays out and where you end up.
Right.
So once a month, I started sending an email, updating people on the ground I was covering, my learning so far, what questions I had, what areas I wanted to tackle next. And it started creating this virtuous cycle of people that were not only drawn into the story in like a making of the band kind of way, but where it's not just about the music, but it's about the actual, like the personal journeys of the band members. But also they were helpful. I would say, I want to tackle this area next. I get flooded with introductions. I go talk to those people, and then with their permission, I would add them to the distribution list as well of this once a month newsletter, which was some accountability for me on a lonely journey. So that's kind of how it started. And then
so it started as a newsletter and then evolved to the podcast.
Well, when I was sending the newsletter, then I had some friends on there from my old professional pursuits as well. And so they started contacting me individually and saying, like, I feel like you do. What should I do? And I said, well, I don't know what you should do. Otherwise, I'd be doing it. But I wish you could be a fly on the wall for all these great discussions I'm having. So the podcast was essentially just a way to start building a knowledge repository for those that came after me, since there seemed to be more and more of those kinds of people. And essentially on the podcast, it wasn't meant to be a media company. It still isn't. It was just meant to be, to capture the learnings from these people for others that also, so they have a more efficient path to get up the learning curve. So started doing that. And after a few months of that, then my inbox started filling up with people that I didn't know, that were binging on the podcast. And I had random things too. Like I remember walking in my neighborhood and my neighbors down the street, I never even told them that I had done the podcast. Maybe they saw me posting about it on one of the social sites or something, but this husband and wife who, the husband's an entrepreneur, the wife, was a CFO of one of the local school systems. And they had listened to every episode. At that point, there were maybe 30 or 40 of them.
Wow.
So there were things like that. My inbox was filling up, and the people that were emailing were really engaged. They were really strategic, and they came from really diverse places. So that felt like interesting signal to me. And I knew about them. They didn't know about each other. They were also longing for a peer group. I mean, it's a lonely ride, and as many people listening can probably relate. And so I set up this Slack room, which is just this like online community room that's like private and free, and just stuck them all in the same digital room. And that community, then the community has kind of evolved to be the center, where the podcast is just one of the picks and shovels for this growing community of people to learn. And there's a lot of other things happening in that community too. There's over 1,200 people in there. There's some modest dues associated with it, which is not a big moneymaker. It's just like a way to, stop the bleeding a little bit without passing a hat around as a nonprofit. And so we could just focus on impact, basically, not worry about advertising or sponsorships or things like that. And there's a number of events and programming by members and for members. There's members in there from all over the world. They congregate around topics, not around skill sets. So it ends up building a bunch of connective tissue across areas that don't typically end up in the same room, which has been really powerful to observe. And then there's a number of founding teams that have come out of there. There's a number of nonprofits that were started in there. There's a number of open source projects getting actually worked on. There's a bunch of hiring and companies that have raised money and funds that have gotten limited partners in there, and things like that.
One of the things I love about this story, I don't know how many people who are watching you today also sat in for our webinar with Kelsey Wirth, who is the founder of Mothers Out Front.
I've met her. She was one of the people I reached out to on my climate journey.
Oh, that's so great. Her story's not so different. It's like she felt like she didn't know enough. She knew this was a terrible problem. She wanted to act, and she did. Years ago when I was Secretary of State, as you know, I was Secretary of State for 12 years, I had mentioned this. I had this saying, I would go and do a lot of public speaking, that you only have the power you choose to take. But if you choose to take it, you can make real change. And that we do all have that power of just saying, okay, what's my role? How can I make a difference? And it'll start with learning often. And it's just wonderful. I am really curious with your story about, some of the complexities of climate change that you've explored with the experts you've interviewed. Anything stand out? Anything really surprising? Anything you want to share with the folks who are listening?
Well, that's also kind of there's been like chapters in the story. So, I mean, the first wave of questions I had for people was like, are we screwed? And like,
Good question.
is it even worth trying? Or is it too late? And then then the next chapter oh, actually it's not too late, but there's a lot of noise out there. And most of the things that people are talking about are maybe distracting, but there's these like fundamental breakthroughs that if we just kind of filter through the noise and focus on the things that matter, then then we can make real impact. And then actually I've kind of evolved from that, where I think the next phase was more around oh, actually, like, this is a systems problem, and everything matters, because it's like a rainforest. Like, our world is like a rainforest, like it's all interrelated. And so if it, well, in order to facilitate innovation, you need policy. Okay, well, are you going to wait on? Well, how do you get policy? Well, you get elected officials to put it through. Well, how do you do that? Well, you get them to feel like they won't be in office if they don't. Well, how do you do that? Well, you get people to vote. Well, how do you do that? You get them to the polls. Well, and how do you get and they need to care. How do you get them to care? Well, you need to fix our education system, right?
So everything touches everything, ultimately.
Yeah, and even like, well, corporations need to step up and put pressure. Well, why are they going to do that? Well, they're going to do that if they feel like they're not going to retain their best people. If they don't, because people will refuse to work there if they don't do right, instead of just maximizing for dollars. So everything is kind of interrelated. So whereas at one point in the journey I might have discounted things that weren't like moonshots, I think now I have a much more open mind about big things and small things and everything in between. And I think it all matters. And the important thing is just to start and do something. And if this is my current thing, and maybe my next fourth chapter will be different, but my current thinking is that if there's one thing that's more important to move than anything else, it's just kind of getting a higher percentage of people in the world to actually like have an understanding of what it is and where we need to go, so that then wherever they sit, whether it's just as a college student or as a grade school kid, or as the leader of of one of the biggest countries in the world, right? That they will use their platform and their seat to do the best they can to bring about change in whatever ways they're best equipped to do, which will look different for every person.
That's really interesting. So what you're talking about reminds me a little bit of a study that came out of the Yale Institute on Climate Communication, and where they do public opinion surveys, and they did an analysis of the NRA and the power that the NRA had to impact policy with a very small minority of people, but that small minority of people voted on guns. And so they looked at like, what would that mean if we have even a small minority of people who are voting just based on climate change and climate action? And it sounds very much like everything touches everything, but at the end of the day, if you don't have people who feel passionately and are doing something, then nothing gets done. Is that sort of what I've heard from you?
Yeah, and also that, I mean, people, like, a lot of people ask me, well, where should I start? And I actually really believe that it matters much less where you start than that you just do start. And so you should start with the thing that comes most natural to you and that's most intellectually interesting to you and has the least friction. And then over time, just give yourself the freedom to do the things you enjoy and stay away from the things that feel like taking medicine, and then find a way to make your mark in a way that feels natural to you. Otherwise, you're not going to stick with it over time. And I mean, it's not that I think the things I'm doing are the highest impact things for anyone to do. I just think they seem to be the highest impact things that I can do. And one of the reasons for that is not because I found some gap in the market and, you know, we
Right.
hired McKinsey to figure out where there was white space. No, it's because of my unique personality and my strengths and my weaknesses and the things I enjoy and the things that I don't and the things that I'm like weirdly good at and the things that I'm not. And then I just found a way to kind of apply those in a way that seems to have created this little flywheel
Yeah.
and be working. I mean, we're still very early. It's not like I'm, you know, earning a living or things like that. But but we're very excited about the potential for the things that we're doing and hope and plan to be doing it for a long time. And I feel really fortunate to have that opportunity to at least try to make a go of it.
That's great. So when you're talking with folks about climate change, how do you move from just the intellectual conversation to actually inspiring people to take that next step and take action? I know your message is do anything, like just get started. But is that enough? Do you think? What has your experience been?
Uh, well, my approach has just been like, if you just keep pulling on threads and piecing it together, then just take the leap that, you know, take the leap into the great unknown and the answers, you know, will emerge on the journey. But people work differently. Like, you know, one, I was just in a position where I didn't have to immediately leap to how do I earn a living? I had some flexibility, so I could take a more academic approach and leave more to serendipity. A lot of people aren't in that. Most people are not in that position. But even the people that are in that position, some people just feel better about like doing something and then even if it's a now thing and then building from there, right? I kind of like to get a lay of the land.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a right answer. I think it's just a right answer for a person. I also, you know, I think getting more people to care is something that like is an important role. That is not the role of the things that we're building. Similar to when I built the running platform, we didn't view our job as to convince people to care about making fitness a habit. We once people were ready to do it, but they needed help, they needed guidance, they needed motivation to stick with it, they needed encouragement, they needed incentives, they needed, you know, a community of people cheering them on and camaraderie. Like that's where we could help. Like same thing in climate. Like I'm not trying to convince people to care. I'm trying to get the people that care a lot but are frustrated because they don't know where to pour all their ambition and energy and build bridges for them to find their spots.
One of the things that I've observed over time is that there's this whole range of ways to be active, from like the mothers out front focusing on gas leaks in your community, something very local, or converting to electric buses, to really taking a look at your stock portfolio and making sure you're not investing in places that, you know, in fossil fuel. For one thing, it's a bad investment in my view. You know, we know there's going to be regulations. So if you're in fossil fuel, you know, it's, you know, probably not a secure investment over time. And so really thinking about like, how do you play? Are you on any boards? Can you influence those boards to take action? So in each of our lives, we've got a sphere of influence. So it's thinking about how do we exercise that sphere of influence, whether it's our pocketbooks talking, or, you know, talking by actually going out and being an activist, or by donating to causes, or, you know, or working on policy, right? There's so many ways to be involved. I'm curious about whether or not with, you know, podcasts. At one point I was in conversation about doing a podcast on climate resilience across the country. And then I learned just how complicated it can be to really develop and sustain a podcast. Were there lessons that you learned in, you know, as you were developing the podcast that really became the basis of involving people and getting people involved in this community?
I think it comes back to just starting. I mean, I didn't know anything about it when I started and just held my nose and put myself out there. And then the earlier you do that, the quicker you learn and the quicker you get yourself to a place where it's not embarrassing. And that's a journey. I mean, there were one or two of the first episodes we published, we recorded, we didn't ship. But then by the third, we've shipped every one, unless the guest for some reason said they had an off day or that their communications team didn't approve it or something like that. Yeah, I think it's just starting, and we also, I mean, some people will fix their own water leaks and redo their electric sockets and repaint their house and things like that. Like, I'm not that person. I know how to find a general contractor who has great subcontractor relationships, and then manage that relationship and make sure they have what they need and it's set up for success. And
You're a manager.
when do we call them, and when do we use a TaskRabbit, right? And so similar approach. Like, we don't try to do everything ourselves, but we're also super lean and scrappy as well. So it's just kind of some combination, and different people will have different mixes of what things they choose to take on themselves. But I don't think there's a right path. I think the only thing that matters is that you find a path that works for you. The same thing with home maintenance. And I also think the important thing, again, just comes back to just starting and putting one foot in front of the other and learning as you go.
So as a non-scientist, you're talking to some pretty technical people. How do you translate the science and sort of the technical pieces around climate change so that it's accessible more broadly to the folks in the community and your audience?
Mostly, I think one of the reasons the show resonates with an audience of people is because I am one of them, and I'm just asking. I'm not pretending I know anything I don't. I'm not doing 100 hours of prep so that I can come in and sound smart. No, I actually don't do much prep, and I just come in and practice active listening, and I'm intellectually curious, and I also then have the benefit of all the hundreds of discussions I had before, so I can incorporate. It's like, well, it's interesting you say that, because the perspective from this side of the world is this, and then I see this initiative over there, and that didn't work, and so, like, what do you? And so then we can just, it's like the more we go, we have better and better discussions just through repetition. It's not any magic to it. It's just, again, putting one foot in front of the other and being really curious and kind of pushing to get to the truth. I try to ask hard questions of every guest, regardless of whether I agree with their perspective or not. But I also try to make sure every guest has a positive experience coming on the show, whether I agree with their perspective or not. We're not media. We're not looking for clicks. We're not trying to convert people to any one worldview. We're trying to get, to a more informed worldview and enable each listener to get to a more informed worldview, their own worldview from a more informed position. But in a way that's objective and not propaganda or biased in any way. I mean, I'm sure I have biases, subliminal biases, but I try to do the best I can to keep an open mind and evolve my thinking as more data presents.
I like the idea of curiosity as the driver. And I think that's probably right. Is like, if we come to these things with curiosity and a willingness to ask questions, then it can lead us all sorts of places. Let me remind our audience that if you've got a question, please put your question in the Q&A box below. So feel free to add yours in there. And you recently launched the My Climate Journey Collective. Can you talk a little bit more about what this collective is and what you hope to do with it?
Yeah. So, well, My Climate Journey, the acronym we go by is MCJ. So that's kind of that's kind of the brand. And essentially, there's three pillars. There's content, which is the podcast, the newsletter, and then other types of education or knowledge, that we will bring about over time. There's the community, which is the Slack room, and then the events and programming that take place around that, whether it be, like demo days for companies to showcase what they're working on, or whether it be, roundtable discussions with experts around a certain topic area that people want to learn more about, where they can ask questions of the group. Or we had some political candidates come, not as a fundraiser, but just to talk about some of the issues and some of the key races and some of the policy concerns and things like that, and just more from an educational standpoint. And then, on the investing side, initially it was just another learning tool where I intentionally wrote as small checks as I could that I would still be allowed on these cap tables directly. And I didn't want to set money on fire, but I didn't really view it as a financial investment. It was more like, if I found a great team that was focused on a big area for decarbonization that had some smart institutional money either in there or coming alongside, I just wrote a little check. And I did probably 15 of those. And again, that's a very fortunate position to be in. So obviously not everybody can do that, but in a way, it's kind of messed up that like people look at that as like reckless, but people look at, paying for, huge grad school loans as perfectly rational, right? And it's such invaluable education, just kind of learning by doing. So on that round, and you have the potential to get some returns. So I don't know, whereas with grad school, anyways, that's a longer discussion.
You're feeling good about it.
Yeah, but I did probably 15 of those, and then some of those companies started raising follow-on, and then there was a subset of our member community that is, highly liquid and super motivated to help support and super, and believe strongly not only that the world needs to go in this direction, but that there's money to be made, and also like had been part of the community and seeing all the things we touch and what we know and our approach and who we are and wanted to be a part of it. And so they were kind of bugging us, like, that they wanted to, like, when are you going to raise a fund? When are you going to raise a fund? And so initially we just started on a per company basis, enabling people to kind of like play behind our hand like one does in blackjack, but then ultimately pull the fund together. And what's cool about the fund is that there's no institutional LPs. It's all like smart strategic people that can be helpful to the portfolio. And it's like former founders, it's operating executives from some of the biggest technology companies in the world. It's like
how do you pick the companies to come in? How do you find opportunities? Because there's so many out there.
Well, because of where we sit, we just see a lot, and we spend time with not only with companies but with experts that come out of academia and with a bunch of larger funds and with accelerator programs and the government agencies like ARPA-E, and we just we just kind of have this swarm of smart, well-placed people that are kind of around us in the community, which is one of the reasons why the community is so happy that there is this community, because it's just such a great collection of people and there's such a great spirit in the community. So it gives us an unfair advantage because we have so many people to lean on to help us along, because we don't know what we're doing. But we also, our checks are small relative to the round sizes, and we tend to co-invest with larger institutional funds that have bigger in-house teams and PhDs on staff and things like that. And we also do our own work, but to some degree, we're drafting behind the process of these larger firms that we tend to invest with multiple times and start building up mutual trust.
In terms of your investments, are there particular technologies or disruptive products that you're excited about that you feel comfortable sharing? Not necessarily the name of the company, but in terms of...
Yeah, well, we have a really wide purview. I think one of the misconceptions, people hear about how much money was lost in the last clean tech wave, but climate tech, we need to decarbonize every sector of our economy. So climate tech, obviously energy is a big part of that, the biggest part, but it's not the only part. And there's a lot of other parts that matter. There's, food and agriculture and industrial processes, and there's, financial and business model innovation, and there's like carbon accounting for SaaS models for big companies, and there's climate risk modeling for forward looking so that you make decisions about where to put your big and movable infrastructure and things like that. And insurance needs to get figured out so that, for example, people will still be able to buy homes and won't run the risk of financial ruin if their home has a natural catastrophe, which is obviously increasing in many parts of the world. So there's a lot. And for us, we look for stuff that is highly ambitious from a capitalist standpoint, but also highly ambitious from an impact standpoint. And where some climate funds have like a gigaton threshold or things like that, for us, when we write our memo on why we're investing in a company, part of the story is the impact story. So we don't have a quantified threshold, but we need to write down like what the impact thesis is, and we need to believe it. And also it needs to be credible to people that are way smarter than us. And so, if we find, so we ask ourselves before we do an investment, like we put ourselves in the shoes of us on the other side of that, writing that memo. And if we can't do it and feel good about it, then we don't invest. But we're just getting going. We're 4 or 5 months in, but it's been a very wide range. It's been fertilizer that's 80% less GHGs to using satellites and machine learning to help utilities better manage their forestry to avoid wildfires, to a climate-friendly food brand that also has a platform that helps any food brand launch a climate-friendly line through better understanding their footprint, sourcing ingredients, et cetera, packaging, like their whole kind of footprint end to end. Electric jets. What else? I'm missing about, converting carbon to valuable products, whether it's car parts or anything else. There's a pretty wide range, and in any given day, it's crazy just the amount of breadth that there is out there to evaluate from, which increases the importance, by the way, of investing with funds that have deep sector expertise, because as a generalist, we do not. But for a client-focused company, because of our purview of the community and our founder experience, we can be super helpful in terms of whether it's the next round, whether it's hiring, whether it's the heads of sustainability at the big companies, whether it's the heads of the venture arms of the big strategic, the big strategics in their industry, whether it's the government agencies for grants, or the climate journalists, or the heads of the academic labs, or the postdocs doing relevant research. Those are the types of people that kind of live in our orbit.
Sounds really exciting. And, I know there are numbers of these kinds of investing groups all through New England, and probably, I assume, the country, where it's groups who come together to think, okay, how can we be angel investors, or how can we really identify opportunities to help these emerging climate companies, succeed. And you're right, there's decarbonization isn't just energy, it's really looking across everything we do. I know there's been a focus on how do we manage our buildings, our commercial buildings better, so that we're wasting less energy, and making sure that our HVAC systems are operating in a way that allows us to ultimately maybe even get off of fossil fuel entirely. There's so much potential. And of course, Boston is a hub for innovation with MIT and Harvard and, Tufts, all of these incredible places of learning. Do you find that you're working with that intellectual capital a lot in your community?
Well, the interesting thing is that because of the pandemic, I have one. Actually, I have a couple colleagues who, one started in LA and is now here in Boston. The other one's been in Boston the whole time, right near me. But it's been, both started in the last year, and one started like 2 weeks before the pandemic lockdown, and then I haven't seen him since, even though he lives a mile away. And the other one I've never met in person. I think they're both on this call. But then, our purview is global. We've made international investments. We have members of the community from all over the world. So yes, to your question, but the weird thing with the pandemic, and we'll see what world we step back out into, but I ask what part of the world they're in when I talk to people. My day is filled with Zoom calls, and geography is not a constraint. Time zone is a constraint, but geography is zero constraint, which, and my wife says, like, that fund was pulled together in 4 weeks, where a lot of those people would have required plane flights and in-person meetings, whereas you can cover the same ground. You can be in 10 different states by lunch, that just really fundamentally changes how work gets done.
We saw that too at the Nature Conservancy, where I have these meetings with people all over the country now. And in the past, that wouldn't have happened, or it would have required a commitment of 2 days, a day to get out, a part of the day to meet, and then a day to get back. And think about the carbon, that would have been used in those flights. I have a sense coming out of the pandemic, we're going to be changing. We're going to keep some of the good that we've learned, with these the way to not travel, but yet engage, across the globe in this way. So it's interesting to hear that you've also experienced the benefit of it. We do have a question from one of our listeners who says, I'm close to retirement, looking for volunteer opportunities that can help with climate change. Any suggestions? And I know, I mentioned earlier that, there's different scales that you could be looking at, right? You could be looking at neighborhood, you can be looking at, um, you know, uh, going to the legislature. Do you have suggestions for folks of how they might get involved?
Yeah, I would start by especially close to retirement where you're at a phase in your life where you don't want to deal with any BS. You should just ask yourself what you enjoy. Like, do you get more fulfillment by, being around people or working independently? Do you get more fulfillment around, around local or around global? Are there particular areas, or because it touches so much, like social justice is a climate story, and energy poverty is a climate story, and to some, nuclear is a climate story, and policy is a climate story, and preserving our democracy is a climate story, and journalism and education, and there's just so many places you could go, which can be paralyzing, but at the same time really freeing to do some introspection and make a list of what criteria are most important to you and make a plan of attack. Like, think of either organizations that meet that criteria and start reaching out to them, or just think about what criteria of organizations, and then asking people to populate what organizations you might want to speak with, and then get introductions to organizations just to learn, like, hey, I have time and I'm really inspired by your work, and I don't know if there'd be a spot, but it'd be fun to just learn more about what you do either way. Are you open to talking to me? And once you start, then it just builds from there. Like, the word will start getting out that you're around. You'll start learning. You'll start getting more clarity about like what things you like and don't like. You'll have a better idea of like what questions to ask to get to the root of whether something's a fit or not. You'll try some things, they might not work, but it'll lead you to doing other things. Like, I think just like my bias is always going to be towards action.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then we got a related question. What have you found to be the most effective organization or charities to make a difference?
Oh gosh, well that puts me
It's a
on the
big question.
spot. Well, first of all, I'm not an expert, so I have a much less of an understanding of the philanthropic world than I do of like small high growth startups, for example. To be clear, but certainly, I mean, there's great organizations, whether it be a Nature Conservancy or a World Resource Institute or an EDF, or kind of the big blue chip, like doing the important work and have been there for a long time and will be there for a long time. Then there's other like upstarts that are much newer, that are less far down the path, and so to the extent that because I don't have a salary and stuff. I mean, I'm not some big donor or anything, to be clear, but I do a little bit of philanthropy, and the places I tend to put my dollars are the the smaller upstarts that maybe aren't yet on the radar. Not because I don't think the big ones are doing amazing work, but maybe it's like the startup bias from my professional pursuits. But there's an organization I really like called Carbon Plan, that's new. The leader of that organization came out of he was at the Chan Zuckerberg initiative, and he's I think he's like a neuroscientist, but he figured out that you can take open science principles and apply them to the carbon markets, and to providing more rigor and consistency and transparency to up the quality and additionality of the projects, and started a nonprofit to like start applying that rigor in an unbiased way without any of the misincentives or anything else. So that's a cool one. There's another one called Environmental Voter Project. That one's pretty cool. They're a local Boston organization,
Yeah.
and
I think they're great, by the way, folks. They really, because it's again back to the principles coming out of the Yale project and climate communication. We need climate voters. That's what's going to ultimately make the difference with policy. So
they've identified 10 million people who are eligible to vote, who environment is their number one cause, and they don't vote for whatever reason. And so their sole mission is just to get those 10 million people to the polls. And oftentimes they don't even mention climate. They just say whatever it takes to get them to the polls. And then the last one I'll mention is one also local called Climate Neutral. And that's one that essentially from a nonprofit standpoint helps companies that want to get to net zero emissions in their overall footprints to better understand where they are, better map a plan to start improving the things that they do, and then how to think about if they do need to offset or purchase negative emissions or anything like that. Just kind of hold their hands through the process and connect them with the right partners and that kind of thing. Yeah, so those are three. There's plenty more though. And obviously Nature Conservancy does great work as well.
Yeah, thanks. We also have a question about the new administration and whether or not having a new administration in town, is that going to change your work or your world at all?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is that in a world where there's tailwinds, then then it puts wind in our sails and accelerates our efforts. And in a world where there's headwinds, our work gets even more important. So either way, the work is important and doesn't go away. And from a so what I feel like is I worry about the things I can control, and I don't worry about the things I can't control. I try to find ways to control those things, but also like I'm going to do this work either way. So I don't tend to blow the wind. Like I'm just trying to put one foot in front of the other and do the work that we do. And we don't like betting on future policy that we can't control if it comes and when it comes. At the same time, future policy will help a lot.
Right.
So that's kind of how we go about it. Is that either way, we just try to make the things happen that need to happen. And then to the extent that policy and government and R&D and grants and, Apollo programs or anything else will help facilitate those efforts, then even better. And we're very excited that might be happening more now over the next several years. But it wouldn't discourage us in any way. If it wasn't, it would make us that much more determined to work even harder. But I feel that we did dodge a bullet though. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely the way we feel in the Nature Conservancy. It's like, having a climate forward looking, administration just means that we need to double down on the work we're doing on, nature-based solutions and natural climate solutions. How do we make sure we're drawing carbon out of the atmosphere? How do we make sure we're advancing as much progressive climate policy as possible during this time? And if anything, it makes us work harder at the moment, but because there's real opportunity for action. So we've got a question about what are your thoughts on developing climate apps that help people engage and take action? Is there such a thing as somebody who's
there's a lot of people trying.
Yeah.
And I mean, given that I kind of came from that world in fitness, you would think that if I were to start or invest in a company, that it would be in that area. That's one of those things I think is important. It's hard. I'm very skeptical of just behavior change and how hard it is. And I think it's important. I'm glad people are trying, but like, as an investor and a fiduciary of other people's money, put it this way: we've seen a number of approaches. We're not really that active in that area, but it's not because we don't think it's important and we don't want it to work. It's just that we haven't seen any approaches that give us the confidence and conviction. I will say, if you look at like China, for example, they've had some massive success in that regard, and so potentially there's some learnings that could be applied in the more Western markets, but none that we've seen to date that we've had conviction about.
So another question about how do you think we might generate climate investments in nature-based solutions as well as technological solutions to rapidly reduce emissions?
Well, I am an investor in one company called Pachama, and Pachama is all about reforestation, and they are helping farmers who have land that could be certified to go through that process in a way with much less friction, and then they're playing matchmaker and connecting them with the big companies that are looking for ways to to make up the difference for what they can do by cleaning up their own supply chains and footprints and things like that, and they're helping facilitate more reforestation, which we think is great. We've heard of ideas of there was one person I talked to. I don't think he ended up proceeding with this project, but he was pretty excited for a while about a fund that would own land with trees, but rather than being in the timber business, essentially it was like the liquidity would come not by selling the timber, but by just like buying and selling shares of the fund, but over time, growing the land that has the trees and keeping all the forestry and protecting it, which she thought was an interesting idea. That's not an area of my expertise at all.
Yeah.
but there's there's many different ways, but oftentimes it's it's like the creative approach that's like, oh, you're coming around to get people to do the same thing that everyone's been trying to get people to do that they know is important, but you're doing it in a way that we never would have thought of before. And
Yeah.
it's not to say that it always has to be that way, but sometimes it's like if you're, it's like the recipe for insanity is trying the same thing again and again and expecting a different outcome. It takes like a, like a beginner mind to, to try this thing that people would have said is so dumb that no one would even try it because that would never work. And then it just does. Most of the time it doesn't, but sometimes it does.
Well, and for folks who are curious, TNC has a program called NatureVest. So Google that when you're done, and that's the way the Nature Conservancy is using impact investment to really think about how do we scale nature-based solutions for climate change and also for water quality. I mean, it could be used for many environmental solutions. Like, how do you think about an investment model that really can help us scale? Because you need the private sector. It's not going to happen just from policy change. It's going to happen. We're going to save the planet by living differently, by spending differently, by investing differently. It's the whole package. So we've got a couple more questions I want to get to before we're done. There's a quick one. Do you see biomimicry catching on?
I don't know anything about it.
There you go. I knew that was
doesn't mean it's not catching on. It just means like I just can't, I'm not equipped to comment on it.
Yeah. And I would say from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, it hasn't caught on yet, but there are a lot of smart people who are looking at biomimicry and looking at how do you create systems that mimic natural systems to address climate change, both on the adaptation side as well as the mitigation side. And so there's a lot of work going on right in Boston or in Cambridge on just that. So if you had to choose only 3 things to read or listen to besides your podcasts to better educate yourself in this space, what would you direct people towards?
Well, gosh, there's so much in it, and it is hard to navigate because I don't feel like we necessarily need more information. I feel like maybe we need better curation, and because there's just so much out there. But I found, some of the drawdown stuff is helpful just for a lay of the land. It doesn't necessarily connect the dots for understanding the nature of the problems and what solutions could bring from a mitigation standpoint to actual action. I know that that's in their plans to try to address that in subsequent versions, but it is good to just understand.
So for folks, he's talking about Project Drawdown, and I would say it's one of the best that I've seen. I love it. There's a book called Drawdown, and I recommend it because it looks at it does an analysis of the problem and then helps us look at innovative solutions to the problem. And it's a starting point. It's not the whole thing, but I would agree that it's a great, easy to digest, but big picture thinking as well as on the ground solution kind of book. And there's a whole website and project because they're continuing to build their knowledge base.
And just some other journalists that I enjoy. There's a new publication from Bloomberg, and Akshat Rathi, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He's one of the journalists, but there's a number of journalists doing great climate work there. There's a Quartz reporter who's part of the MCJ community, and I've really enjoyed some of their climate stuff. There's a couple of independent newsletters. There's one called Heated, and there's another one, I forget what it's called, but it's by Dave Roberts, who used to work at Vox. So those are some that I've enjoyed. I feel like I'm going to get off this call and kick myself that I missed some important ones. And Deb, if you have any others, please.
Yeah, no,
please
just so you know, we are going to follow up from this. There'll be a follow up from this webinar with a copy of the recording, and as well as a list of follow-up materials and websites you can go to. So there'll be an opportunity for us to add some other things for you in that email. So we don't have to put you on the spot. If you can think about it, we'll be able to put it out as part of the follow-up email. So for a final question, What area or sector have you not yet invested in that you're most focused on or excited about getting into?
Uh, I, I, the I mean, we want to better understand what's happening in terms of the digital platforms to enable companies to, the biggest companies to do the work that they need to do in all facets to help facilitate essentially rewiring their companies to be, more, more in line with the international targets and with just where we need to be more in harmony with with the planet we rely on to support us and other life forms. So and there's a lot kind of in there. I mean, that affects like forward-looking risk and planning, that accounting, just understanding. It affects offsets and credits and negative emissions and some of that. And actually just a number of other, I mean, within the supply chain, that's a big complicated thing, and sourcing ingredients or materials is another thing. And so, I mean, within that, there's a lot of different opportunities, but that's just generally an area where we think both fits nicely with our experience, but also where we think there's opportunity from an impact and from a financial standpoint. Also, just forward-looking risk and resiliency. I mean, it gets poo-pooed, but we think it's really important too. I mean, it is important to prevent. Like if you take health, for example, it's important to do the right things to prevent, but you also want the best care for when you're sick. And so we also think that that's an underinvested area, and that can take many different forms, but helping have better insight and prediction to then inform decision making in all of its forms is an area that we're excited about as well. Excited might be the wrong word, but where we think there's both important work to be done and also opportunity.
Real opportunity. Yeah, I would agree on both of those counts. So listen, we're approaching the end of our time. And how can people find your podcasts or subscribe to your newsletter?
Yeah, so if you just go to myclimatejourney.co, so there's no M at the end yet, but just myclimatejourney.co, then you'll find our website, and that's got a link to the newsletter. It's got a link to the different episodes where you can that you can find on any of the big podcast players. Yeah, and it's also got information on membership in case anyone wants to take a look at being part of the member community as well.
That is really great. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who tuned in for your support of the Nature Conservancy. It's your support that makes all of this work possible. We'll be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today, and maybe some of the ones that we didn't talk about, but we think you might be interested in, and a recording of the webinar. Feel free to share them with your friends if you've enjoyed this webinar, pass it along. You can also follow us on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram. And that way you can keep up with our work and get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect with us. And to that end, please join us on February 10th and 11th for our next webinars. On February 10th, we'll be talking with TNC's Director of Science, Dr. Mark Anderson. He has brought to us a game-changing approach to conservation that identifies top priority landscapes that need to be preserved so that we can withstand climate change. Then on February 11th, we'll speak with Karen Mauney-Brodek. She's the president of the Emerald Necklace Conservancy. Karen will talk about how the Conservancy works to maintain and restore this important area of land and how the global pandemic has impacted their efforts. And as always, you can find the latest webinar schedule and register at nature.org/MA webinars. And I just want to thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.